Yes, indeed. This company deals in art, and many artists travel widely so. Yes, we heard the name of a certain silversmith from Mr. Huskins. In that moment, Hugh's face finally belonged to a proper art seller. And in the same moment, Hollow transformed from a girl blithely eating apples into a wolf. Hollow transformed from a girl simply eating apples into a wolf. Mr. Huskins gave us the name Fran Vonley. Wrinkles appeared on Hugh's soft forehead. He had the peculiar facial expression common to all merchants when their most profitable secret is discovered. But Hughes had been a merchant for a long time, and as such he knew all too well of treating any visitors who were sent by someone as important as Huskins. I am aware of her. I hear she is a remarkable silversmith. Hughes gave a pained nod in response to Lawrence's statement. She makes her living with painting, but her true trade is a silversmith. I don't know how she's managed it, but she's close to many important figures, and to a one, they're all infatuated with her skill, especially those who've made their fortunes by the spear and shield. For an art dealer like Hughes, she would be like the golden goose. He could have gone on at length. Lawrence cleared his throat. Could you introduce us to her? No one wanted to let a competitor get close to their golden goose. Lawrence certainly understood the feeling, particularly when it was an unknown traveling merchant, a poverty-stricken urchin boy, and a wolf spirit. He could hardly be blamed for imagining himself being devoured at first. It was obvious that Hughes was weighing Huskins' debt, his own profit, and his personal safety against each other. Who will then put a finger on that scale? Yuitsu. Huh? Hughes looked at her. Yuitsu is an old name. Few still remember it, and those who remember where it is are still fewer. Perhaps Hughes' mouth was dry, as he was now constantly trying to swallow. I seek my homelands, Yoitsu. So what say you? Have you heard of it? Holo was behaving poorly. It was true, but it was clear that she had become tired of keeping up appearances for their own sake. If you know, I want you to tell me. Just look at me. Holo seemed small, and her head was bowed. If her tail had been bare, it surely would have been drooping between her legs. Well, it was enough to surprise even Lawrence, and Hughes was well past surprise and into shock. He finally stood from his chair and flapped his mouth, as though trying to say something to Lawrence and Cole. It was true that engaging in a real negotiation would have been bothersome, but there seemed to be a basic change in Holo's attitude. In Winfield, she had learned just how naive she truly was, and this from a sheep, of all animals, an animal she had taken every opportunity to deride. And here she was not making high-handed demands, but simply asking for information. And while Hughes might have been a courageous man, he was a generous one. But please look up. If the old one sent you, if you'll go to such humbling lengths for me, then come. I too was born as a sheep, and I will aid you, so please, raise your head. At these last words, Hurlo slowly looked up and smiled, and perhaps it was strange to think it of someone who had lived as many centuries as Holo had, but it still seemed to Lawrence that her smile was just a bit more grown-up. Hughes offered warmed wine instead of Chapter 2 of Volume 12, Spicy Wolf. Hughes offered warmed wine instead of apples. It'll warm you up. Please help yourself. Lawrence gave his thanks and brought it to his lips, and Hollow did likewise. He doubted she would like it and stole a glance at her. Cole was the only one who had been given warm goat's milk, and seeing Hollow's eye, which was envious of him, was rather entertaining. Now then, you want to know about Fran Vonley, the silversmith, do you? Yes. Lawrence got the feeling that Hughes still had something left to say, and soon he came to the conclusion and replied, "She's in town right now, as a matter of fact." Hollow smiled, an obviously unfriendly smile, which Lawrence had to admit he understood. Still, it was no surprise that Hughes was trying to protect the asset. Lawrence lightly patted Hollow's knee before turning his attention back to Hughes. "Doing painting or smithing, I suppose." "No, she often travels here or there, saying she's making preparations for just that. But just when I was thinking I hadn't heard from her in some time, she comes wandering in saying she's heard tell of a certain legend." "A legend?" said Lawrence, as though to make sure he had heard correctly, which made Hughes nod. "Something about a village known as Taussig. It's up next to a long, wide mountain range in the north. The mountains are tall, the forest deep, and she's come in pursuit of a legend regarding a lake in the area, she said." Hearing the words mountain, forest, and lake, Lawrence looked at his companion, but Hollow did not look back, and instead his eyes met Cole's, who was sitting on the other side of her. "Mr. Hughes, do you know anything about this legend?" "Certainly I heard tell of it, as I'm sure you're aware. We have our own information sources, and to a certain degree we can tell whether such things are real or not." "So you're saying there's a good chance it's a fake?" Hughes nodded. "But she's a stubborn person. Once she's decided on the shape for a silver piece, she won't budge. Although many people find such vehemence to have a certain charm to it. So she won't have enough time to draw us a map. Perhaps not, though, Lawrence prompted him, which made Hughes reply with regret in his voice. "It's true that she often journeys into the north in search of subjects for her silversmithing, and I imagine that she's become more familiar with the old names of places there than old Huskins or myself are." Since she's the only one actually going there, Lawrence nodded and urged Hughes to continue. What he had said so far did not answer Lawrence's question. "So yes, but I don't know if she'll simply draw you a map if asked to. I had to work very hard in order to establish a relationship with her." So, Hughes wiped the sweat from his face. Assuming it was not an act on his part, Fran Vonley was indeed a difficult person to get along with. "What? 'Twill be simply done," Hollow said, casually baring her fangs at the rattled Hughes. "All they had to do was threaten her. Was that the joke?" Hughes smiled, but not out of amusement at the jest. Crafters were a famously stubborn lot. There were stories of legend and legendary blacksmiths who had been been driven to the verge of poverty, licking rust from their anvil to stave off starvation, rather than forge a sword they did not want to forge. It would have been foolhardily of Lawrence to just show up one day and ask her to draw them a map of the Northlands. "I understand entirely," said Lawrence. "But would you be able to put in a good word for us, at least?" Hughes nearly fell forward at Lawrence's question. Perhaps it made Lawrence's firm resolve all too clear. She's a very difficult individual, you see. It would be difficult to convince her to meet someone she did not already know." Lawrence contemplated the problem. Hughes was torn between maintaining his relationship with a particular silversmith or doing right by Huskins, who kept the haven for sheep spirits like Hughes. Sorry. I just heard my dad just do this freaking moan. It was funny. Anyway, Hughes was torn between maintaining his relationship with a particular silversmith or doing right by Huskins, who had kept the haven for sheep spirits like Hughes. God. In weighing one against the other, he was leaning toward the silversmith. Had they not gotten whatever sign from Huskins they needed in order to obtain Hughes' cooperation? Or was he just not a very duty-bound person? Or was Fran Vonley a silversmith of such ability? It was not beyond Lawrence's ability to reason this out. Neither was it difficult for an art seller of Hughes' ability to guess at what Lawrence was thinking during his short silence. If Hughes displeased Vonley, then he would be facing something even more dangerous than Hollow. In a pleadingly serious tone, Hughes began to speak. The reason I'm so loath to displease her is related to my trade, but it's not about money. Trade was always carried out to seek money. Lawrence's curious gaze fell upon Hughes, who seemed to gather his resolve. He stood and walked over to one of the paintings on the way. The place in this painting was once called Dira, long ago. It was one of the largest paintings in the room and depicted a jagged, craggy landscape. Standing before a bare cliff was a single hermit, but both hands raised to the heavens as though in prayer. It seemed to be a depiction of the legend of Dira's patron saint. Such paintings were common, but as far as Lawrence knew, pieces where the settling was more of a focus than the subject were unusual. As a thought occurred to him, Hughes said something unexpected. "This is my homeland." Lawrence felt Hollow stiffen beside him, but long ago it was a fertile, productive place. Without any of these rocks, that cliff is a claw mark. Hollow's voice was a hoarse whisper of the moon-hunting bear. Yes, it is something that my kind will never forget. These paintings were created with the help of individuals like Miss Vonley. It had been decades now. For the sake of my kind and those similar to me, I collect and deal in such pieces. Pieces that show the homes we were forced to abandon, or the disaster that made returning home impossible. It would be a lie to suggest that I have not profited in doing so, but that is a secondary concern. Hughes gazed into the scene of the painting as though a great window, and even the landscape of this painting is now no more. I hear the veins of gold were discovered there. It's ironic, actually. The guide I hired in order to have this piece made found the gold, and even if that hadn't happened, wind and water would wear the land away until it's entirely different. The paintings of the other room, and the paintings hanging in the churches and manors, too, mostly showed landscapes that have disappeared or are even in the process of disappearing. And the paintings themselves will not last forever. Hughes touched the frame of one of the pieces, gazing at it for a while, after he had finished speaking. This was a place where tiny pieces of vanishing worlds were stored for safekeeping. The passage of time might seem slow to humans, but to his kind it was surely too fast. Their memories of the past were all that remained, and the gap between it and the present grew even larger. He suddenly looked back at Lawrence with a troubled smile. His gaze was probably directed at Hollow, but Lawrence did not turn to check. He knew that doing so would surely hurt Hollow's feelings. The only one who could speak to Hollow of this was Hughes, who had lived as long as she did. "If possible, I would like very much to help you. This place does not exist only for we sheep, you know. My customers have included deer and hares and foxes and fowl as well. Lawrence heard the sound of rustling cloth as Hollow shifted. He would not ask what she had done. However, friend Vonley's knowledge and skill are irreplaceable. She has a perfect memory, never forgetting anything she's seen even once, and a sense of purpose she holds more dear than her own life. She is utterly dedicated to capturing the landscape in her art, and I cannot afford to lose her cooperation. There's no time. The energy in Hugh's eyes was not something that would see in someone who works solely for his own profit. The evidence of life that he and his kind had lived was inexorably disappearing, and he was engaged in the work of trying to preserve a record. Lawrence dwelled on Hugh's last words. There is no time. Did he mean that the landscape was vanishing too quickly? There's no time? Yes, we must hurry. There are a multitude of places I hope Miss Vonley will paint, but her lifetime is limited. I think about it often. If only she could live as long as we. Lawrence doubted he was the only one to make a surprised sound at the revelation. He'd assumed that friend Vonley was a special being, like Hollow and Hughes. That led to the considerous... that's not even a word, I don't think. That led him to consider the obvious next question. If time was such a concern, why didn't he and his kind simply do the paintings themselves? Like you, I meant to be a merchant, said Hughes. Lawrence realized that he had been scratching his head in confusion, and Hughes had likely guessed as what he was thinking. Hughes looked down, then sighed, smiling. He looked at the paintings on the wall and narrowed his eyes. I understand what you want to say, and in all honesty, we did once take up the brush, and those comrades of mine who went north and east and captured the old landscapes in the south, landscapes that are now long gone. Those comrades of mine were not immortal. Although it was the wolf spirit who lived in the wheat, and Lawrence remembered her words, that if the wheat in which she lived disappeared, she too would be gone. And she herself had a natural lifespan. But Lawrence could not imagine that Hughes was talking about natural lifespans. Hughes' quiet eyes regarded him. They were the deep, placid eyes of a wise and ancient man. They took up their brushes and traveled abroad, carefully observing the state of the world out of a deep sense of duty. And what they found were forests cleared, rivers dammed and changed, and mountains dug up and scarred and scarred. Eventually they could stand it no longer and traded their brushes for swords. Lawrence had heard this story before. He glanced at Cole, who listened raptly to Hughes' tale, but they were outnumbered. One was burned by the church, another crushed by an army. One was so mortified by his own powerlessness that few remain even as memories, having vanished like so much sea foam. Humans, apologies. Not at all, Lawrence answered, at which Hughes displayed a sad smile. Humans have amassed great power. Control of the world has been theirs for a long time now, and our age has passed. Those unwilling to admit that they have one by one fallen in battle now exist only as legends on parchment, and even those parchments are crumbling, mice nibbled and moth-eaten. We are what remains, sheep, and the human sense of sheep. None of us, myself included, have the courage to hold a brush. The bravest of us were the first to fall. It was a terrible cruelty. Lawrence understood all too well why Hughes was more concerned with friend Vonley, a human, over his fellow sheep Huskins or Hollow the Wolf. Hughes and his fellows had surely not revealed their true nature to her. If so, there were not many ways they could keep her close. To have her create paintings for them, they would bow down before her, avoid any offense, and hear any demand, no matter how unreasonable. Even admitting her existence to Lawrence was clearly a great compromise on Hugh's part. "It is indeed cruel," said Hollow, sipping the sour wine Lawrence was sure she did not like. "So this is why you were so upset upon seeing me, was it?" Lawrence looked at Hollow, and Cole did likewise. Well, birds and foxes had visited the sheep, perhaps a wolf never had. Wolves had fangs, claws, and the courage to use them. They would have been the first to turn to violence, and they would have been the first to die. Hughes looked evenly back at Hollow and then slowly nodded. "Yes, even so. As well. I would have been sadder to learn of the opposite. It was because such courage suited her that Hollow earned the name Wise Wolf." It was in this moment that Hughes ceased to seem fearful of her. "I envy such strength for my part. I've often wondered if I'm to live so long, why I couldn't have been born as a stone or a tree instead." At the end of the conversation, Hollow began to speak without any inhibition. "Cannot say I feel the same way. Were I a stone or a tree, I could hardly travel with these two idiots." Hughes smiled. Indeed, life in the world of humans can be rather enjoyable. They're an amusing lot. Yet Lawrence could not help but feel that it surely had not been an accident that the wine they were offered was not very sweet. Gold, silver, copper, iron, tin, lead, brass, stone. The phrase "gems hidden in earth" was a common one, but sometimes it could be hard to tell what was valuable and what was not. As Lawrence and company waited for Fran to return from her wandering about town, Hugh showed them around his storeroom. It contained not just paintings, but the wealth of fine crafts and ornaments that had been sold off to Hughes alongside those paintings. "There are many fakes here, but here's a bar meant for holding down scrolls. Looks like it's only gold-plated, though." "Ah, yes. Here. What do you make of this one, eh? Horn Hafner Hughes, master of the storehouse, seemed not to know exactly what it contained. As he weighed the gold bar in his hand and made his pronouncement, Hughes had told Hollow about Fran because Hollow was a being similar to himself. But he was still a sheep spirit and a merchant as well. He had to get some value from his transaction. He led Hollow and Cole to the back of the storehouse, as they wanted to know whether he had any paintings of Hollow's homeland of Uritsu. But as he did so, he kept a close eye on Lawrence, a traveling merchant who wandered from nation to nation. Did not have much purchasing power, but he made up for it in knowledge and fresh information. No doubt Hughes wanted to know if any of the dusty old pieces in his store were unexpectedly valuable. Lawrence felt like a pig trained to sniff for truffles. It was true that demand varied from town to town. In one town, anything with a whiff motif would sell, while in another, the color of gold would be so coveted that even gold-plated items would fly off the shelves. Given the occasion, Lawrence was only too happy to spill everything he had heard about the towns, whose conditions might be good. Such a town might as well be drunk. Absurd items would sell on the spot, and given the the amount of junk in Hugh's storeroom, it was like a golden trash barrel. "Well, that's about the size of it. I see. I'm deeply grateful, yes. Well, I do hear stories all over a while. I sit in my shop here. Most of my visitors aren't walking the path of trade, so I collect little information that's useful in business." Even as he spoke, Hughes took notes with a quill pen in the margins of an old bill of receipt. Assuming his high spirits were not a ruse, he seemed to think they would lead him to a healthy profit. Hollow would scold if Hughes had ever asked her, but Lawrence was a merchant. As such, he considered such thoughts. His eyes were drawn by a single item in the piles of junk. Is this? Oh, so this is where I left that old thing. Lawrence pulled the item out from between two wooden crates, and Hughes reached for it, smiling merrily. Lawrence could not begin to imagine what the thing was for. He handed it to Hughes. It was a golden apple. Old would surely laugh to see it. What in the world is this used for? Oh, it's one of those you use to warm your hands. Your hands? In response, Hughes handed the apple back to Lawrence, who noticed that it was indeed a bit warmer than it had been a moment earlier. It's the merchants who want to show off their wealth a bit. You can heat it by a fireplace, or have your apprentice warm it with the skin. Then use it to warm your hands, as do your writing. Though anybody who dares use it outside when traveling in the winter will find their hands sticking to it. Hughes was quite right. Still, Lawrence had no trouble imagining curling her body around the trinket while riding in the wagon, like a hen protecting her egg. He found himself thinking it might be rather useful, but then quickly snapped out of it, and shook his head. This was no time to be distracted by such silly items. Lawrence returned the apple to Hughes. Still, thank you. There was so much for the information, said a pleased Hughes, who had nearly blackened the margins of the bill of receipt with notes, careful not to leave as much as a single detail out. Not at all, thank you. By all means, when you're finished, feel free to linger. You're most welcome here. Hughes sounded like an ordinary merchant now. Lawrence smiled, nodded, and shook his hand. Though it seems Master Cole and Miss Hollow are still looking at the paintings. Hughes had to exert himself to bring his round body to his feet, and he had then peered farther into the back of the storeroom. Hollow was flipping through a stand of paintings one by one, chattering with Cole about this and that. Hughes fell suddenly silent as he watched her. Lawrence had a good guess about what he was thinking. I asked how you were all related. It was a reasonable thing to wonder about. Hollow should have overheard, but she gave no evidence of it. Lawrence decided that there was no reason to hide it, so he answered just as he walked over. My trading route generally covered lines farther south. I happened to meet Hollow at one of my stops there. I see. Hollow had been asking a favor by a friend long ago, that she would guarantee bountiful harvest of the wheat in a certain town, but over time the village forgot about her, and she decided to return home. My wagon happened to be passing by, and she simply hopped in and stowed away. He smiled amused, but there was a coolly calculating quality that showed through. Hollow's story was not irrelevant to his own experience, but it had been some several centuries since she'd left her homelands, and so he doesn't know where they are. So we've been traveling here, and there, in search of them, we met Cole on the way. He's from a town in the north called Pinu. Oh, Pinu? Hugh's eyes widened in surprise. He looked over his shoulder at Hollow and Cole. It's quite far away. But I see now why old Huskins would have told you of Fran fondly. Lawrence gave Huskins a deliberate smile. There was nothing amusing about the story, but if he had failed to tell it with a smile, Hollow seemed likely to be angry. The Northlands are a place of invasion and conquest. The place names are always changing. It might be that I do not know this Yoitsu of yours. I simply know it by a different name. Lawrence nodded, but was shocked at what Hugh said next. When you said you wanted a map of the North, I thought for sure you were involved in the conflict up there. Hughes was speaking in jest, but seeing Lawrence's reaction, he too was stunned. You're not, are you? Are you referring to the events surrounded by the Depot Company? The rumors are true, are they? No doubt Hughes collected information along with paintings. And this was the destination of the river that flowed right through the Depot Company's front door. No. If you want to know whether it's true, the fact is that I have no good evidence. It's a place constantly awash in unpleasant rumors. What do you yourself believe, Mr. Hughes? Hughes' troubled expression was that of a man whose joke had been taken seriously. He seemed to give up on trying to escape and reluctantly opened his mouth. The simple truth is that I have no interest in it. Lawrence thought he must have misheard. You have no interest? That's right. More than a few of us are just simply plugging our ears and closing our eyes to the tale. Just as we did with the moon hunting bear. They'll mine what they can mine, and when they're done, they'll leave. In any case, scenery is not eternal. Though the landscape might change completely, the land itself was not simply disappear from the earth, so even a placid sheep was only occasionally looked up from its grass eating to regard the scenery around it with its black eyes. Could see the way of the world. It would be easy to curse Hughes for being a coward, but there was a certain truth to his thinking, and he could hardly be blamed for his realistic outlook. One saw all sorts of things during travel. Villages beset by mercenaries, towns suffering bitter feuds between landlords. There was nothing to be gained in opposition, and they were powerless to begin with. The only answer was to hold still and hope the storm would pass. That's why I've never tried to learn anything more about it. I'm not strong like old Huskins, and if I knew more, I would only worry me, just as it worries you and Miss Hollow and young Cole. You smiled frantically at this small joke, a signal that he was hoping to end the discussion of this particular topic. It was true, the more one knew, the more one wanted to know, and the more detailed the knowledge, the stronger the urge to interfere. It was difficult to argue with the wisdom of someone who had endured cataclysms. Lawrence had no right to disturb Hughes' life, and Hollow would surely feel the same way. I apologize for asking. Not at all. I'm sorry I couldn't be of any help. So then, will you be returning to your room? Inquired Hughes. Lawrence looked at Hollow, who raised her head and shook it no. Then pointed to Cole. The boy was busily looking through a stack of paintings. Evidently, they still had search left to do. I'll be returning on my own. I see. Might I offer you something warm to drink in the parlor? As a merchant, Lawrence was surprised at these words. The storeroom contained a great many valuable paintings as well as examples of gold and silver smithing. To leave perfect strangers unattended in a room was an act of significant courage. Lawrence reflexively thought. Hughes noticed this and smiled. If she wanted to steal from me, it would be faster for her to simply bite my head off. And anyway, we forest dwellers don't lie. Would have sounded as if he was trying to flatter Hollow, but perhaps that was reading too much into it. Lawrence bowed his head politely. My apologies. Hughes chatted with Lawrence for a while before retreating to the rear of his shop to work. Lawrence sat in the room, waiting for Fran, reading through a travel account of a merchant who claimed to have journeyed the world over, found city of gold in the Far East. But just like the information Lawrence had sought from Hughes, the knowledge that could be gathered in a trip around the world would be incredibly valuable if true, and therefore making it public would be the height of idiocy. In other words, the travel account was merely nonsense, but it was amusing nonetheless. Just as Lawrence found himself laughing at the absurdity of one of the most improbable details, the golden smithing flew through the space between his eye and the book and landed him in his lap. He looked up in surprise, and there was Hollow, looking as she does, dropping something. His eyes were next drawn to the dropped object in his lap. It was the golden apple he has been so amused to discover in the storeroom. Was it not tasty? He picked up the apple. It was warm, size-wise. It seemed just about a fit for Hollow's hand, he thought, whereupon that same hand snatched it away from him. You humans do love your gold. Though it would be a bother if everything turned to gold. Too much of a good thing, went the old saying, but Lawrence was a merchant. In that case, find something that's not gold and sell it high. Hollow sniffed and then sat down beside him, looking displeased. She did not groom her tail, she simply toyed with the golden apple in her hands. Where's Cole? Lawrence asked, which made Hollow tilt her head. Her eyes were flattened, which did not suggest anything good about her mood. She had probably left him in the storeroom. It was a rare state of events, and Lawrence could not imagine many possibilities. Couldn't find anything, huh? Any paintings of Yuitsu, or its region, or any landscape that Hollow remembered? And no doubt she had thought that with so many paintings, surely at least one of them would hold what she saw. Her disappointment would have not been so great if she had thought from the beginning that nothing would turn up. What stung was having hope stashed. Worse, they had surely found many landscapes that Cole recognized. Hollow held the golden apple in both hands and nodded faintly. That just means there's still something to look forward to, eh? Lawrence knew he would rouse her anger by saying so, and indeed her ears prickled up. But that did not last long. The stream slowly slipped from her, and the words came tumbling out of her mouth like water from an uncorked bottle. Is it wrong of me? Wrong, Lawrence repeated, which Hollow nodded. Like those sheep, Hugh said, most of them plugged their ears and shut their eyes. Lawrence looked away from Hollow momentarily and looked at the book and closed it. It was a delightfully beautifully bound volume. No doubt the name of the raconteur, merchant responsible, would be remembered for centuries. You mean about wanting to get involved after hearing the truth? Asked Lawrence, which Hollow nodded at. Hollow seemed cold and calculating, but was quite hot-blooded, and whenever she saw someone suffering or in trouble, she wanted to help. If humans were to assemble and march upon the forest and mountains, ravaging the land and killing the animals, she would want to help the resistance, even if the land weren't Yuitsu. And while the outcome might be well recorded in legend and song, victory was surely impossible. Because if it was possible, someone else would have already won it. I may say this or that, but the truth is that I think of myself as special, said Hollow, sounding faintly amused, perhaps to cover her embarrassment. I can get through most things simply by showing my fangs. I can draw out the way of things. That's what I thought, but when Lawrence held out his arm, Hollow glanced at him with a look of hollow amusement, pasted onto her face, and then took it, wrapping it around herself like a muffler and clinging to him. There were no paintings there of the land I knew. What does that mean? Each of the pieces had been either commissioned by a specific buyer or stored away in anticipation of someone from the region appearing and recognizing the landscape. It was not hard, therefore, to come to this conclusion. There were no paintings of Yuitsu, because there was no one from Yuitsu to order them. It was easy to imagine her wolf comrades leaving an eternal journey. And what was the basis for this? No doubt many of them, having confidence in their own teeth and claws, chose to fight. And even if they had likely fled from the moon-hunting bear, the world was abundant with absurdities. If they had been able to find weapons, they would have risen up and fought somewhere. The ones who ran away from everything, who insisted of taking up arms, simply fled. Would have been called cowards at first, but it was those cowards whose roots still clung to their earth, even now. Plugging one's ears and closing one's eyes for fear of the truth is all I can do to laugh at such foolishness. But who is the master of this shop? Who is it who still knows many of his old friends? Who is it who even now still works to offer comfort to his kind? Compared with that, the nails of Hollow's small hand dug into Lawrence's arm. What am I doing? She was not crying. Hollow was not sad. She was ashamed. The raging river of time had changed the world, and she and her kind had stood on the shore, not only powerless, but their very existence suddenly in doubt. It was more than enough reason for Hollow to gnash her teeth. Lawrence put more strength into his embrace, drawing Hollow in. Nobody knows what the right thing to do is. Hollow's head smelled faintly of dust, perhaps because of the time she had spent in the storeroom. You yourself have been prepared to put your life at risk for the sake of your principles. Am I wrong? Hollow did not move for several moments. Just think about when you were buried in the ground. You're Hollow the Wise Wolf, aren't you? No doubt her comrades would be very pleased to know that Hollow was thinking of them. But what would they think of her standing in front of their gravestone forever? Regret could mean struggling to turn back time, or it could mean swearing not to let the same thing happen again. The two meanings were very different. Hollow nodded. She was neither child nor fool, and yet she still could not contain these emotions on her own. And I do know one thing, said Lawrence, which made Hollow's ears prick up. He smiled, but not to cheer her up. When you worry, so do I. When he had traveled alone, there had been no one to whom he had to utter the words, nor anyone who would say them to him. When he would get involved in a risky trade, he would make boastful jokes about dying by the side of the road. A dear friend was dead forever, but a living one existed only the here and now. Fool, she whispered, though it was by no means clear to whom, perhaps both to herself and to Lawrence alike. Quite right, said Lawrence, so the next thing to do is, Hollow's voice caught in her throat. She had not left Cole alone in the storeroom simply because they had found only landscapes he recognized and none that she did. Given Cole's disposition, if they were unable to find any paintings of Hollow's homeland, he would just keep looking. And the more he looked, the heavier the weight of not finding anything became. Hollow had not exactly taken her frustration out on him, but back in the storeroom, just how bad was Cole feeling? I'll go apologize, said Hollow. You do that, said Lawrence paternally. And Hollow broke free from his embrace and grinned a toothy grin. Time could not be turned back, and the correct choice was never obvious. So one had to try to enjoy the present at least. That was all Lawrence could say. The rest was up to Hollow, he thought, as he reopened the book. Miss Fran Vonley has returned. Before standing, Lawrence lightly tapped Hollow's knee. He looked back. She was wearing a bright smile, which was more than a little suspicious. From behind Hughes, he was no doubt unused to having such a smile directed at him by a wolf so nearby, appeared a young girl. She was not much taller than Cole, which put her at about Hollow's height. It was her appearance that made Lawrence's face pale despite himself. She did not have Hollow's ears nor horns like Hoskins had. She was just a normal girl. If you ignored the color of her skin and her eyes, is this the merchant who called after me? Her voice was beautiful and clear, and spoke of a good upbringing. There are many forms of beauty in the world, but Lawrence had never before seen the sort Fran had possessed. Her hair and eyes were jet black, and she had the dark brown skin common in the desert lands of the south. Hers was of bewitching beauty, She had a mysterious charm to her, the power of all who survived in the hellish deserts. It felt as though she would not quail, even if Hollow took her wolf form, then and there. Lawrence swallowed, and then finally managed to speak. "I am Kraft Lawrence." Fran Vonley smiled and gave a slow nod. She introduced herself. "I am Fran Vonley." "Shall we sit?" said the considerate Hughes, and Lawrence Company all took a seat. Cole clung to Hollow's clothing before finally managing to sit, seemingly dazed by Fran's mysterious quality. "So what is it that you wish to ask me about?" The people of the desert spoke a very different language, but Fran's words were well practiced. Her pronunciation was careful and precise, and her education must have been a costly one. They were said to be a different people, or difficult people, but perhaps such worries were unfounded. Lawrence thought behind his merchant smile. He told her his business. "Yes, we're journeying in search of a certain place in the Northlands. All we know is the ancient name of the place. We've heard that you're very well versed in the old tales, which is what brought us to visit this company." Fran's face was serious as she listened to Lawrence. "And what is the name of this place?" "Yuitsa." Fran narrowed her eyes at Lawrence's answer. "That's the old name of a rather remote area." "So you're familiar with it?" Lawrence asked with emotion that was half act, half genuine. Fran, unmoved, was like some stoic seer. "I am aware of it, but few are able to draw maps of the North, making them extremely precious. Be able to compensate you properly." The moment Lawrence said it, Hollow's foot came down upon his, but it was too late. Perhaps Hollow had seen through Fran's true nature. "Properly?" said Fran, surprised, standing behind the chair in which Fran sat. Hughes covered his eyes. "In that case, 50 limon ought to suffice." Hers was the attitude of an artisan inexperienced in the ways of negotiation. Lawrence asked himself if he had let his guard down so badly, but even if he had, there was no going back now. There was no way he was going to pay 50 limon for a single map. It was such a basic technique that it bordered on child's play. Lawrence found himself at a loss for words, both because of his foolishness and because of Fran's unexpected boldness. But Hollow was standing right there. She had to say something. He was just about to when Fran's clear voice rang out again. "However, given the circumstances, I suppose I wouldn't mind doing it for free." "Huh?" Lawrence could not help but let his mask slip completely, and he could feel Hollow's slump in annoyance. It was hard to fix a cog once it had gone askew. But it was not foolish Lawrence to whom Fran directed her words. It was Hollow. "I noticed you're dressed as a nun." "My name is Hollow." Even Hollow seemed surprised to be addressed, and she replied only after a short pause. "Miss Hollow, is it? Pleased to meet you. I am Fran Vonley." Hollow, who called herself the Wise Wolf, was a calm huntress and never let excitement get the better of her during a hunt. "Have you something for me?" "Yes. If you're a nun, then I would ask a favor of you." It was Hughes, who seemed flustered at these words, probably about to protest, but Fran raised her hand and silenced him. She was a prickly artist indeed, the very image of one. "So long as it's in my power." Fran cocked her head, rather than smiling. "It's not so difficult a thing, Miss Hollow, Mr. Lawrence, and, Curl. My name's Cole." She nodded at Cole. "Mr. Cole, then, just what should she have them do?" "With the three of you, it should be fine." Hughes looked at Lawrence with a desperate look that said stop. Fran spoke. "I'd like your help in Taussig." "Is that?" "Yes, I suppose you've heard of that from Mr. Hughes. It's the reason I'm in this town. I would ask your assistance in learning more about the village's legend." Lawrence was underwhelmed. It seemed such a simple thing, but from Hugh's nervousness, it was not as simple as it sounded. Despite his failure moments earlier, Lawrence prepared himself for the irrational he would earn from Fran when he begged more time to consider. But it was Hollow who skipped past that entirely. And you'll draw us a map if we assist you? She asked. Yes, so long as you gather information and verify its truth. Lawrence was not unaware of the reason for Hollow's smile, for Fran was a clever girl, more than clever enough to inflame Hollow's love of competition. Normally, she would have laughed off such a vague request as gather information and verify its truth, demanding a clearer request depending on the circumstances. She was not above arm twisting. Normally, she would have laughed off such a vague request. And yet, without asking even one more question, Holly simply nodded. It's a promise, then. My thanks, Fran bowed her head. Standing after she looked back up, she faced Hughes, who had tried so hard to get a word in and hold her up. And the preparations for departure? They're all finished. Very well. We'll leave tomorrow. Mr. Lawrence can handle the wagon. Lawrence nodded, and though Fran seemed ready to continue speaking, he headed off in a final effort to save some small amount of face. Tomorrow should be fine. At this, Fran smiled faintly. Perhaps she found Lawrence's attempt to puff himself up amusing. Her smile was that of an innocent maiden. Lawrence again regretted his misstep. It was surprisingly easy to manipulate an innocently and honest, stubborn person. What was truly difficult was someone who knew how to handle and use their smile, which was why Lawrence was constantly burning his hands when dealing with Hondo. Had he known he would be facing someone who would deploy a smile like that at will, Lawrence would have prepared better. He had been too hasty in embracing the impression of her that Keeman and Hughes had given him. Mr. Hughes, said Fran, causing Hughes' round body to stiffen straight. I'll take my dinner in my room. I have preparations to attend to. Very well, but... She used the same smile Hofton so often favored. Hughes fell silent and swallowed. He nodded obediently. Please explain the details to Miss Hollow and her companion, if you will, said Fran, and then took her leave. The tail next to Lawrence was puffed up, but the smile was a pleasant one, which was all the more alarming. Lawrence attempted to, at least, avoid the mistake of trying to make an excuse. I'm sorry. Phew, said Hollow. Not so much as looking at him, Cole cringed away as though trying to let sleeping gods lie, and Hollow, still smiling, made no move to speak further. Perhaps feeling the awkwardness, it was Hughes who finally raised his voice. I've suffered my share of her boldness and unyielding smile, too. She is a stubborn, obstinate silversmith. I chased her in town, across fields, and the mountains, finally saving her from an accident before she could finally speak to me. So, are you fortunate she was even willing to deal with you, even on the vaguest of terms? These last words were directed at Hollow. Hollow nodded decisively, finally wiping the eerie smile from her face. So, is there something important in Tossic? Lawrence asked after recovering his composure. Hughes merely shook his head. It's just a village like any other. So why then? Hughes looked down briefly, then back up, as though peering over spectacles. Their legends of the forest and lake isn't so special a thing. It's said that once an angel walked alongside the river that flows from the lake, then leapt up a waterfall to Golden Door that opened alone with the sound of a heavenly beast cry. It did indeed sound like the sort of a legend one could hear anywhere, but Hughes continued. In addition to that, there's another story like that. Another one, Lawrence asked, at which Hughes nodded. Nodded and began to explain, a certain tone of exhaustion in his voice. I suppose you could call it a witch legend. I don't know the details myself, but I hear it's rather famous upriver around Lenos. Evidently, there's a legend that a nun, also said to be a witch, came to Tossic and settled there, or perhaps it's closer to a rumor. The Lord of Tossic is loyal to the church, so, of course, if they are strongly to deny that there's a witch there. But, I see. And because of that, the villagers there are extremely suspicious of outsiders, right? Hughes nodded. The reason Fran asked you alone, Mr. Lawrence, is because she knows full well that no one there will so much as speak to her if she goes alone. If nothing else, her ethnicity is very uncommon in this area. Hughes had lived longer than any human, so Lawrence certainly understood why he would say so. Lawrence, too, had only rarely seen people with brown skin like Fran's. Is she from the desert? This is the story. But she's had no parents as long as she can remember and claims to have been raised by a wealthy money changer in the Duchy of Loandir. I have little sense of how she came to be a silversmith. She's joked about being a slave, but given her attitudes, I wonder how much of that is a joke. Lawrence understood Hugh's uneasy smile, given Fran's dictation. Anyone would come to a certain conclusion about her background, of course. Slaves could be treated very differently depending on their master. And she might have been brought into a kind of wealthy household, or just as easily adopted into the family, but treated cruelly. There were places where this matched what we had been told by Keeman, and even if not everything lined up, there was at least a certain amount of truth to it. She certainly got pluck. Yes, sometimes I think she must be a form of line of warriors somewhere, but in any case, she had seen many secrets. Oh, and please keep this a secret, of course. Hughes nodded and Lawrence returned to the topic at hand. Mr. Hughes, you seemed a bit apprehensive. Do you think the village will be dangerous? Villages were often less welcoming than one might think for a variety of reasons. If they were situated in a place where far traveled, that alone was enough to make outsiders seem suspicious. If it was the sort of place where rumors of a witch would circulate, they might as well start to wonder if every visitor had some secret agenda. To be perfectly honest, I don't know. They're not a place of business. The villagers rarely visit the town. Townspeople go there even less often than frankly. They're like a jar of food, where you've forgotten where you put it and when. It was an apt metaphor. One would hesitate to open such a jar for fear of what might come out. Oh, do you suppose there's anything that would be dangerous even with me along? It was Hollows whose quip cut through the atmosphere of heavy tension between Lawrence and Hughes. Lawrence met Hughes' eyes. The two were surely thinking the same thing. If you say so, it matters little what we might say, but, said Lawrence, then I care not. In exchange for 50 gold pieces, she gets to use us as she pleases. Such nerve. It would have been better if Hollow were angry, but she spoke with a smile, said Lawrence. So Lawrence's hands were tied. And that fool is even knowledgeable about the Northlands that have you so all intimidated. It is not just an old man, Huskin said. It was indeed. It's true that he only cares. It is true that he who chases two hares catches neither. But no matter how interesting things are stored in that head of hers, it's still just one head. So if we do not bite it here, when will we? It was a lively speech, and yet Hollow was not the one to say such things lightly. She only did so because she had faith in her comrades to be trustworthy enough to correct her, to challenge her. That was the feeling Lawrence got, looking at Hollow's invincible smile, which meant he had no reason to disagree. So that's the way of it. And Hughes, was it? Yes, he straightened at Hollow's address. Hollow grinned at the stiff Hughes. If we should end up angering that fool such that she never trades here again, it was unlikely, but not impossible, and would be a crushing blow to Hughes' business. What was Hollow going to say? All eyes were on her as she continued in a casual tone. Should that happen, I'll apologize. Hughes was a well-traveled art seller. His forced smile shifted to a general one, and he slapped his large belly. Just like a wolf. Hollow's deliberate little performance, and yet somehow about the unlikely friendship between Sheep and Roof struck Lawrence as miraculous. The next day, Lawrence and company found themselves swaying in the Hughes company, heading north along the road to the village of Taussig. In the wagon bed was a mountain of provisions, bread and meat, garlic and onions, wine, salt, fire, wood, and blankets. Lawrence sat in the driver's seat of the wagon holding the reins, with Lawrence and Hollow and Cole snuggled in what space remained in the bed. Fran, who only knew the way of the village, rode on a horse of her own. It was not particularly long since the time he had driven a wagon, but somehow driving someone else's wagon made Lawrence uneasy. Just who does that little fool think she is? Ola finally said, only getting the words out with some difficulty, since her mouth was otherwise occupied. That delicious, is it? Asked Lawrence, with a resigned sigh as he looked over his shoulder, which made Cole flinch in alarm as he sat next to Hollow. Normally he only ate what was given, but he had finally been bold enough to reach into his sack for a second piece. Not you, Cole. That's only your second piece, right? The one next to you is on her sixth. Lawrence pointed deliberately at Hollow, and Cole looked dubiously back and forth between Lawrence and the sack, finally nodding. They were delicious enough to make a captive, even of Cole, who was the very image of honorable poverty. The leavened rolls had been made with plenty of rich butter. Hollow noisily tore a chunk of a roll, wolfing it down before popping the remainder in her mouth. As her mouth opened and closed in the process, her breath escaped into the cold air in white puffs. Not even Cole could resist the temptation of fresh-baked bread in that chilly wagon bed. Lawrence got a piece of himself, but had not eaten no more, for fear he might get used to such food and never return to traveler's life. If it gets us so much of this sort of bread, you ought to become an artist yourself, declared Hollow. I can sketch simple pictures of goods and drawings of my future shop, I suppose. I showed you, didn't I? He was referring to the days when he had driven a wagon alone, passing his days by scavenging every copper coin that he had dropped in the darkness. Every time he earned a healthy profit, he would spread out some paper and draw the facade of the shop he had hoped to own one day. I suppose. Lawrence's dream had been postponed while he journeyed with Hollow. Hollow drew her chin and moved closer to the driver's seat. She shoved the roll in Lawrence's mouth. She seemed neither apologetic nor pained. Lawrence bit into the bread with a smile. The conversation was only possible because they understood each other so well. "Can you draw, Cole?" Lawrence asked over his shoulder. It looked as though Cole was seriously considering shoving the unfinished roll into his own bag for later eating. He flinched as though having been caught doing something embarrassing. He hastily tried to manage some sort of answer, at which Lawrence could not help but laugh. But before either of them could say anything, Hollow popped another roll she had grabbed into Cole's bag. Well, I suppose I can draw angels or spirits from copying manuscript illustrations." Cole smiled ticklishly at Hollow, and then turned back to Lawrence and nodded. "Yes, when I had no money and was rolling out sheepskin parchments on nails, sometimes the scribes would teach me a little." Cole was the sort of boy who would journey south alone just to get closer to the center of the church's power in order to protect his own pagan village. But he seemed much more suited to poring over books all day than he did to the adventurous suits in which he found himself engaged. Had he been born into different circumstances, he surely would have been a famous scholar. Lawrence turned his attention to Hollow. "And what about you?" "I suppose there's no point in asking." If Hollow was to pick up a brush, no doubt she could draw a highly recognizable picture. I do not draw," You can't eat a picture of an apple, said Hollow, as she helped herself to another roll. Well, Fran's skills must be impressive for her to command such tribute, and she's followed after legends from many lands, said Lawrence quietly, as he looked across the plain before them. The mountains did not seem to be getting any closer. She's seen a lot of trouble, I'll bet. The Northlands are still disputed territory, with belief turning to superstition and superstition to belief with such dizzying speed. Tracking down legends is a dangerous business, given that her price might be a fair one, and the farther north one went, the more difficult it became to find good building stones, which meant even larger buildings were made of wood, without stained glass depictions of saints or figures carved into stone columns, which meant their proselytizing. Proselytizing? I think would rely on paintings. Don't know the word, gonna have to look it up. Proselytizing. Which meant their proselytizing would rely on paintings. Symbolism, maybe another word. With demand up, it stood to reason that the suppliers must profit. She's to be admired, murmured Lawrence, stroking his beard. I've admired quite enough, said Hollow, patting her belly and then setting about curling up in a blanket. They spent the night in the dry, brown grass of the plains. There was not much difference between a horse's walking speed and a human's, so travelers on that road all naturally tended to arrive at that spot come nightfall. It was there that Lawrence halted the horse and built a fire where the grass had been cut low, and the remains of older campfires were scattered about. Happily, there was a large, round log, perfect for leaning against. Former visitors had been similarly grateful. One place on the log had been stripped of bark, and there the former visitors had carved words of thanks. The small party warmed the bread, which had turned hard enough from the chill, by the fire, roasting jerky and cheese to get along with it. There was no wind, but it was cold enough for a small amount of snow to pile up here and there, so they naturally wound up huddled together atop the log like little birds. It was warmer for 3 people to huddle together under these 3 layers of blankets than it was for 3 people to each have 1 blanket to themselves. And it was just 3, not 4. Fran lay down in the wagon bed alone. The stones warm. Lawrence had warmed the top, the fire, and brought it to Fran wrapped in a blanket. She was gazing vaguely up at the sky, using the cargo for pillow. Next to her was some half-eaten bread and cheese, but she was so absorbed in the night sky that she seemed to forget all about her dinner. When Lawrence brought the wrapped stone to her, she shifted beneath her blanket and a hand slid out from under it, accepting the warm rock. As he gave her this, Lawrence thought he saw her holding a thick book under her blanket. When he had traveled alone, Lawrence too had sometimes resorted to stuffing paper under his shirt for warmth when he was unable to light a fire. It could be even warmer than a blanket. Fran too seemed quite accustomed to hard travel. "Are you sure you don't want to sit by the fire?" Lawrence asked. Fran arranged the stone beneath the blanket and looked back up at the sky before answering. "It would ruin my view." Lawrence understood and nodded. Fire kept animals away, but it invited humans. Whether they were friend or foe, eyes accustomed to watching the fire would be useless for looking out into the night. Not only was Fran used to travel, she had accrued a very respectable amount of experience. About tomorrow, Fran directed her gaze to Lawrence after he spoke. She did not seem inclined to sit up, so Lawrence decided to simply continue speaking. "Once we arrive in the village, what sort of arrangements shall we make?" Lawrence had found himself roundly beaten in their first negotiation at the Hughes Company the previous day. Thinking back on it now, he realized it had surely colored Fran's impression of his own capacity as a merchant. Though she had brought Lawrence along to help her gather information,
She probably detested the notion of leaving everything to him and his companions. So he posed this question in a humble, servile tone. But after looking at him steadily for a minute, Fran suddenly smiled and closed her eyes, as though having seen right through the whole of his thinking. "I shall leave it in your capable hands." Lawrence was surprised at this response. But if she was truly going to rely on him, he would do his best to meet her expectations. "In that case, I'll introduce you as a church-affiliated silversmith, and Hollow as a nun. Will that do?" "I shouldn't think there will be any problem with that." She'd taken a moment to consider the notion. She could probably see through to roughly how such a story would be received. I'll be an apprentice nun and maid-servant. Cole will be our guide. I'll be the traveling merchant hired to be the group's eyes and ears. Very well," said Fran, but her smile was a thin one. Lawrence took notice of this. "Is there a problem?" "No, nothing. I was just amused at how, if we assemble the necessary actors, it's true that even I might look like a nun." The ability to see oneself so objectively could be indeed counted as a special skill. Lawrence found himself briefly at a loss for her words. At how naturally Fran was able to speak as though she were looking at herself from the outside. "What church?" inquired Fran. Once he had finished frantically filling in the blankets, and Fran's question, Lawrence said, "Let's say we're from the church city of Ruvenheim. That's certainly more than one church there, and many factions besides. Even if our answer's a vague one, we won't be easily found out." Fran opened her eyes and looked at Lawrence. Lawrence was wondering if he had made some mistake. Fran then looked back up at the sky and spoke. "You're familiar with some rather faraway towns." Lawrence was relieved that it was only this. A lie that can't be disproven is no different from the truth. A place as far away as Ruvenheim is a safer story, they thought. Fran nodded, her gaze still skyward cast. "Was that your base?" Base was a curious choice of words. It made Lawrence sound like a bandit or a mercenary. "I'm a traveling merchant originally from that area." Hollow simply jumped into my wagon bed and when I passed by through a nearby town. Then Lawrence paused and looked behind him at Hollow, who sat atop the log, sipping wine. Only Colin seemed to be looking at he and Fran. So Lawrence turned back to Fran and continued, "and told me that she wanted to go north, and that I should take her. As far as Cole goes, we ran into him as we were heading down the Rhone River, and he joined our travels." Fran's face was still upturned, her eyes closed, but Lawrence nonetheless got the feeling that she was listening to him. For her to be interested in this story at all made Lawrence wonder if he had some sort of attachment to the region. At length, Fran spoke as though giving voice to words she heard from the sky. "So this map of the north you want is for?" She opened her eyes, and when looked at Lawrence, it seemed as though the night sky had melted into them. It was common for stubborn, eccentric people to feel things more deeply than that. Lawrence was not going to use that to his advantage, but he spoke such that his words would have their greatest effects. "Yes. The only thing my companion remembers about her homeland is that it was called Uitse." Fran's eyes did not waver. "I see," she said, closing them. This time not looking up again, but leaning her head over. She shifted lightly under the blanket, and given that a gentle sigh followed, Lawrence realized she was trying to go to sleep. Her way of illiterately ending the conversation made Lawrence understand why she had a reputation for being difficult. It was almost too archetypal. Perhaps Fran was neither so stubborn nor as eccentric as her reputation suggested. Lawrence mused, but there was no telling what would happen if he was to point that out. Lawrence quietly made ready to leave her be, but before he did, Fran spoke one last time. "I'll be counting on you tomorrow." Lawrence nodded, whereupon Fran, just as she seemed to be doing, fell asleep. And that's the end of chapter.